If you had walked through the Meridian Concourse of Crossroads Station on any one of those 3 weeks, you would have seen her, a small girl, maybe 9 years old, sitting alone at the corner table of the cafeteria everyone called the Hollow, her tray untouched, her eyes fixed on a door that never opened for her. You would have seen her, and you would have walked right past, just like everyone else. That was the strange tragedy of it. Crossroads Station was the busiest hub in the Outer Reach, a steel and glass city suspended between 5 trade lanes, with a population that swelled past 200,000 during peak shifts. Diplomats in stiff collars, smugglers with 2 friendly smiles, children running between food stalls, dragging tired parents by the sleeve, noise, light, motion, an entire civilization compressed into a ring of corridors orbiting a dead gas giant. And in the middle of all that life, one girl sat invisible. Her name was Tessely. Nobody on the station knew that yet, not really. To the few who noticed her at all, she was just that quiet kid who eats alone. She wore plain gray clothes, nothing that marked her as anything other than ordinary, and she had trained herself, with the discipline of someone far older than 9, never to look anyone in the eye for too long. Looking too long invited questions. Questions invited attention. And attention, she had learned, was the most dangerous thing in the galaxy. She did not know, sitting there with her cold protein loaf and her glass of recycled water, that 3 corridors away, a security drone scanned her biometric signature every 4 hours and reported it to a private channel that led, eventually, to a fortified suite on the station's diplomatic ring, a suite where her grandmother's appointed guardians watched a dozen monitors and assured themselves again and again that the girl was safe. Safe, but not seen. That was the arrangement. Tessely's grandmother, Sovereign Adrena Voss, ruled the Thenary Compact. 11 star systems for 100 billion souls, a political entity so vast that historians would one day call it the spine of the Outer Reach. After the attempt on Tessely's parents' lives 2 years earlier, an attack that left her without a mother or father and left the Compact's enemies with exactly the chaos they wanted, Adrena had made a decision that no one questioned aloud. Her granddaughter would live in hiding, not in a palace, not behind walls of soldiers, in a place so ordinary, so anonymous, that no assassin would think to look. A space station, a normal school, a child blending into the crowd like a single grain of sand on an endless beach. It had worked, in the sense that Tessely was alive. It had failed, in every sense that mattered to a 9-year-old girl who had not had a real conversation with another human being in longer than she could remember. The guardians, 3 of them, rotating shifts, always at a careful distance, had instructions to intervene only if her life was threatened. Loneliness was not, by their definition, a threat, so they watched her eat alone. They watched her walk to her tutoring pod alone. They watched her sit on the observation deck after lessons, alone, staring out at the slow wheel of stars, and they logged it all as status, nominal. 3 weeks before the day that would, in hindsight, mark the true beginning of everything. Tessely had stopped expecting anyone to sit with her. She had stopped hoping someone might ask her name. She had built, brick by brick, the particular kind of fortress that lonely children build, the kind made not of stone but of low expectations, designed to keep disappointment out by keeping everything else out too. She did not know that on the other side of the cafeteria, a maintenance technician named Cash Calder was about to break every brick in that wall without even trying. Cash was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of perpetually oil-smudged hands that came from 16 years of keeping Crossroads Station's environmental systems from collapsing into chaos. He was not important. He would have told you so himself, with a shrug and a grin, if you'd asked. He fixed air scrubbers. He patched coolant lines. He ate his lunch at the same table every day, the one by the window that looked out on the docking bay, because he liked watching the ships come and go, imagining all the places he'd never been. He noticed the girl the way he noticed most things, not because he was looking for her, but because some part of him simply paid attention to the world in a way most people had trained themselves out of. He saw her sit down. He saw her not eat. He saw the careful, flat stillness on her face, the kind of stillness that took real effort to maintain. He thought, that kid looks like she hasn't smiled in a year. He almost didn't do anything about it. He had a coolant valve to replace before the end of his shift, and getting involved with a stranger's kid felt like exactly the kind of thing that led to misunderstandings, station security reports, complications he didn't need. He told himself this very firmly as he finished his soup. Then he looked at her one more time, at the way she was very deliberately not looking at anyone, at the careful arrangement of her hands in her lap, at the untouched tray, and something in his chest, some old stubborn decency he couldn't quite explain, made the decision before his brain finished arguing against it. He picked up his tray. He picked up the sandwich he hadn't touched yet, still wrapped, the second half of his lunch he'd been saving for later, and he walked across the cafeteria toward the corner table where nobody ever sat. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. "Got more sandwich than I need." Tessie looked up, and for the first time in 3 weeks, somebody was looking back at her like she was just a kid, not a target, not a responsibility, not a name on a security manifest. Just a kid at lunch who maybe wanted half a sandwich. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She just looked at him for a long moment, the kind of assessing look that 9-year-olds shouldn't really know how to give, and then, almost against her own will, she nodded. Cash sat down. He unwrapped the sandwich and tore it cleanly in half, sliding one piece across the table without ceremony. The way you'd share food with anyone, a co-worker, a friend, a kid who clearly needed it but didn't need to be told so. "I'm Cash," he said. "I work in environmental, Deck 9. You eat here a lot." "Every day," she said quietly. It was the first sentence she had spoken to anyone outside of her tutoring pod in 3 weeks. "Yeah," Cash said, like that made perfect sense, like there was nothing strange about it at all. "Me too. Good window seat." He didn't ask why she was alone. He didn't ask where her parents were. He didn't ask any of the questions that every other adult who'd ever glanced their way seemed desperate to ask. The questions that always made her retreat further into herself. He just ate his half of the sandwich and looked out the docking bay and made an idle comment about a freighter that had been parked in the same berth for 2 weeks longer than it should have been. And somehow, without either of them quite noticing the moment it happened, the silence at that corner table stopped being lonely. It became, for the first time in 3 weeks, simply quiet, comfortable, shared. Tessie ate her half of the sandwich. It was nothing special, some kind of pressed meat substitute, a little too much mustard. It was, without question, the best thing she'd tasted in longer than she could remember. Neither of them knew, in that moment, that a security drone had just logged an anomaly, subject an extended unscheduled social contact with unverified individual. Neither of them knew that somewhere on the diplomatic ring, a guardian glanced at a flag alert, frowned, and then, because a man registered as harmless, a station employee with 16 years of clean records, let pass without comment. It was, in every official record that would ever be written about that day, a non-event, a footnote, a line of data that nobody would think twice about. History, as it so often does, was being made in the margins, where nobody was watching closely enough to notice. The next day, Tessie was sitting at her usual table when Cash walked in 15 minutes later than his normal shift break, sweating slightly, an access panel cover still clipped to his belt because he hadn't had time to put away his tools. She had told herself, in the hours since yesterday's lunch, that it had probably been a one-time thing. Adults were kind to children sometimes, the way people were kind to stray animals. A moment's gesture, quickly forgotten. She had built her entire emotional defense around not expecting it to happen again, because expecting things that didn't come true was the thing that hurt the most. So when Cash dropped into the seat across from her, unwrapping a sandwich already torn neatly in half, he'd started doing that on purpose now. She would later realize, splitting it before he even sat down. Something in her chest did something complicated and unfamiliar. It took her a moment to identify the feeling. It was hope, and hope was a thing she had stopped trusting a long time ago. "Sorry I'm late," he said, like they had an actual standing appointment. Like this was simply a fact of his day now. Coolant line decided to be dramatic about it. "What's dramatic about a coolant line?" she asked, and immediately seemed surprised at herself for asking. Like the question had escaped before she could stop it. Cash grinned, a real grin, easy and unbothered, and launched into an explanation of pressure differentials and why Deck 9 secondary loop had been held together with what he called spite and good intentions for the past 3 years. He didn't simplify it for her the way adults usually simplified things for children, assuming they couldn't follow. He'd just explain it the way he'd explain it to anyone, with technical terms and the occasional joke, and Tessie found herself leaning forward slightly, actually listening, actually curious. Nobody had explained anything to her like that in longer than she could remember. Her tutors taught her history, languages, the proper etiquette for addressing foreign delegations she would never actually meet under her own name. Nobody talked to her about coolant loops or freighters, or anything that smelled faintly of real, unglamorous working life. "You like fixing things," she said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yeah," Cash said. "Something breaks, you figure out why, you fix it, it works again. Most satisfying job in the universe, far as I'm concerned. Better than sitting in an office telling other people what to do." He took a bite of his sandwich half. "What about you? You like anything?" It was such a simple question. What do you like? Nobody had asked Tessie that in years. Not because people didn't care, but because everyone around her was so busy managing her safety, her schedule, her education, her legacy, that the question of what she simply, personally enjoyed had quietly fallen off everyone's list of priorities. Even her tutors, who were kind in their formal way, asked her what she had learned, not what she liked. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about everything, with that careful 9-year-old gravity. "I like maps," she said finally. "Old ones. Before everyone had jump drive charts, when people had to draw the stars by hand and guess at the distances. They're wrong, mostly, but they're wrong in interesting ways." Cash considered this with genuine interest, not the polite, distracted nodding most adults gave a child's answer. "Huh," he said. "Never thought about it like that. Wrong in interesting ways. I like that. Most people think it's a weird thing to like. Most people are boring," Cash said, and Tessie laughed. Actually laughed, a short surprise sound that seemed to catch her as off guard as it did him. And something shifted in the cafeteria's corner table that day. Something that would, years later, be the subject of historical essays neither of them could have imagined. They started talking every day after that. Cash would arrive at slightly different times depending on his shift's chaos level, and Tessie would simply wait, no longer with the flat resignation of someone who expected nothing, but with the small, private excitement of someone who had started, very cautiously, to expect something. He told her about the station's quirks, which vending machine ate credits without dispensing anything, which corridor had a flickering light that everyone swore was haunted, which dock workers ran an illegal noodle stand out of supply closet on Tuesdays. She told him about her maps, about the old star chart she studied during her free hours, about a particular constellation that ancient astronomers had named after a creature that, as far as anyone could tell, never actually existed. She did not tell him her last name. She did not tell him about the guardians who watched her from a careful distance, or the security drone that logged every conversation she had, or the grandmother who ruled 11 star systems and who Tessie had not seen in person in over a year, because even short visits required security arrangements so elaborate they sometimes weren't worth the risk. Cash did not ask. It wasn't that he didn't notice things. He noticed plenty. He noticed that she never mentioned parents, that she spoke about my tutor rather than my school, that there's something almost rehearsed about the careful, neutral way she described her daily life, like someone reciting a cover story rather than living an ordinary childhood. He noticed, too, the woman in the gray jacket who sat 2 tables away most days, never quite looking at them, never quite looking away either. He noticed, and he decided, with the same quiet decency that made him cross the cafeteria 3 weeks ago, that it wasn't his business to push. What mattered to Cash was simpler than any of it. There was a lonely kid who lit up a little more each day at lunch, who laughed a little easier, who had started, in the second week of their daily meetings, to bring a small folded piece of paper with a hand-drawn map on it, just to show him, just because she wanted to share something she liked with someone who would actually look at it. He didn't need to know who her family was to know that mattered. The gray-jacketed guardian. Her name was Reska, though Cash wouldn't learn that for weeks. Watched these lunches with a complicated and growing unease that she did not report, not yet, because a report she would have had to write felt, increasingly, like a betrayal of something she didn't have words for. Subject continues unscheduled contact with maintenance technician Cash Calder. Subject displays improved effect. Recommend continued monitoring, no intervention. She had been instructed to keep the girl safe. She had not been instructed on what to do about the growing, uncomfortable realization that safe and, well, had never, in 2 years, meant the same thing, and that a man with grease under his fingernails and half a sandwich seemed to understand the difference better than anyone in Sovereign Adrenovos's entire security apparatus. 3 weeks into their daily lunches, Cash arrived at the cafeteria to find Tessie sitting very still, her hands folded too carefully in her lap, the posture she used, he had come to learn, when something was wrong and she didn't know how to say it. He sat down without commenting on it immediately, splitting the sandwich the way he always did now, sliding her half across the table. She didn't touch it. "Bad day?" he asked, keeping his voice light, the way you'd approach a skittish animal, not pushing, just opening a door she could walk through if she wanted to. "My birthday is next month," Tessie said, which was not really an answer, except that it was in the roundabout way children sometimes answer things. "That's good news, usually," Cash said carefully. "Cake. Presents. People singing badly. Unless your station's cafeteria cake is worse than I'm imagining." That got a small, reluctant smile out of her, but it faded fast. "There's going to be a thing, an event, lots of people I don't know, and I have to wear a specific kind of dress, and say specific things to specific people, and smile the whole time even if I don't want to." She looked down at her hands. "It happens every year. I hate it." Cash turned this over slowly. In 6 months, he had never once asked her directly who her family was, content to let the mystery sit unbothered while the friendship itself did all the important work. But something about the particular shape of this complaint, specific people, specific things, address, an event, pulled at a thread he'd been quietly not tugging for weeks. "Sounds like a pretty formal party for a kid's birthday," he said, carefully neutral. Tessie didn't answer right away. She picked at the edge of the table, the way she did when she was deciding how much truth to allow into a conversation. Then, in a voice so quiet he had to lean in slightly to hear it over cafeteria noise, she said, "My grandmother runs the Venery Compact. I'm not supposed to tell anyone that. I'm not supposed to be friends with—" She stopped, seemingly horrified at what she'd almost said, and looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I'm not supposed to tell anyone. You can't say anything. Please." The cafeteria kept humming around them, trays clattering, a maintenance announcement crackling overhead, somebody laughing 2 tables over, and Cash sat very still, processing the fact that the quiet, map-loving 9-year-old he'd been sharing lunch with for 3 weeks was a granddaughter, the single most powerful person in the entire outer reach. He thought about a dozen things in that moment. He thought about the gray-jacketed woman who always sat 2 tables away. He thought about every news broadcast he'd ever half-watched about Sovereign Adrenovos and her tragic, vanished granddaughter, the one the official statements always said was in protective seclusion for security reasons. He thought, distantly, about how badly this could go for him personally if anyone decided a station technician had no business knowing this. And then he thought about the look on her face, not the look of a girl revealing a secret for dramatic effect, but the look of a child terrified she had just made a mistake that would cost her the only normal thing in her entire life. "Hey," Cash said gently, "look at me." She did, reluctantly. "I don't care if your grandmother runs 11-star systems or runs a noodle cart," he said. "You're still the kid who likes wrong old maps and thinks my coolant line stories are interesting, which, by the way, nobody else on the station thinks. That's who I'm having lunch with. That doesn't change because of who's related to you." "Everyone changes," Tessie said, with a flat, weary certainty of someone who had learned this lesson far too young. "Everyone who finds out. They get nervous, or they get nice in a fake way, or they start treating me like I'm made of glass. You're the only person who's ever just—" She struggled for the word. "Just stayed normal." "I'm not going to stop being normal," Cash said. "I promise you that. And I'm not going to tell anyone. Not because you're important. Because it's your business and you trusted me with it. And that's not something I take lightly." Tessie studied him for a long moment with that searching, too-old gaze, and then, finally, she picked up her half of the sandwich and ate it, and the tension in her shoulders eased by degrees. What neither of them saw was a woman in a gray jacket 2 tables away, who had not heard the words exchanged but who recognized, with the trained instinct of a career security officer, the exact moment a secret had changed hands. Reska did not move. She did not reach for her comm. She simply watched the technician's posture, steady, unbothered, no shift toward calculation or opportunity, and made a decision of her own that would, in time, prove just as consequential as Cash's decision 3 weeks earlier to cross the cafeteria with half a sandwich. She did not file a report that day. She told herself it was because the boy posed no demonstrable threat. The truth, which she did not examine too closely, was that for the first time in 2 years, the girl she'd been assigned to protect looked, sitting at that corner table, genuinely like a child instead of a fragile piece of state property. And Reska did not have the heart to be the one who took that away from her. That night, in her small station-issue quarters, Reska drafted a different kind of report than usual. Subject psychological well-being has measurably improved over the past 3 weeks, correlating with sustained informal contact with station technician C. Calder. Recommend reclassification of contact from monitor to low-risk beneficial. Further recommend this office consider whether current isolation protocol serves the subject's genuine welfare. It was, by any official standard, an extraordinary thing for a security officer to write about a sandwich. It would not be the last extraordinary thing that sandwich caused. For 2 years afterward, the friendship between Cash and Tesley continued in the unglamorous, ordinary rhythm of shared lunches and small confidences, a rhythm so steady that both of them, in their different ways, began to mistake it for permanent. Tesley grew from a watchful 9-year-old into an 11-year-old who laughed more easily, who had started bringing actual conversation topics instead of just maps, who had, against every instinct her training had drilled into her, begun to trust the world a little. Cash, for his part, had become something he never expected to be, the steady, unremarkable center of a girl's entire emotional life, a role he carried with more seriousness than he carried almost anything else, including his actual job. He still fixed coolant lines. He still ate cafeteria sandwiches with too much mustard. But every day at the same hour, he showed up at that corner table because he had quietly decided, without ever announcing it to anyone, that he was not going to be one more adult who let that kid down. It could not last forever, not the way it was. And the day it broke open began, like most disasters, with no warning at all. A diplomatic envoy from a rival faction within the compact, a faction that had never accepted Adrenovos's consolidation power and had spent years quietly probing for the granddaughter's location, intercepted a fragment of encrypted security traffic between Crossroads Station and the compact's central administration. It was a small fragment, mostly meaningless on its own, but combined with months of patient pattern analysis, it was enough to narrow a search from 11 star systems down to a single station, enough to send a team. Reska caught the warning 12 hours before the team arrived, an alert flagged by compact intelligence, routed through channels too slow and too bureaucratic for the threat they described. 12 hours. Not enough time to safely move Tesley through normal extraction protocols, which required clearances in ships and a level of operational secrecy that, ironically, took far longer to arrange than the danger allowed. She found Cash on Deck 9, mid-shift, up to his elbows in an access panel. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," Reska said, and the flat urgency in her voice made Cash drop his tools immediately. "Tesley's in danger. Real danger, not a drill. I need somewhere to move her that isn't on any official list. Somewhere nobody would think to look for the Sovereign's granddaughter." Cash didn't ask a dozen reasonable questions he could have asked. Why him? Why now? How she even knew about him. He simply said, "My quarters. Deck 11, Residential Block C. Nobody officials ever set foot in there in 16 years. It was, on paper, an absurd plan, hiding the most valuable child in the outer reach in the cramped quarters of a maintenance technician, behind no security at all except the simple fact that nobody would ever imagine looking there. But absurd plans built on real trust have a way of working when elaborate plans built on procedure fail, and Reska, against every instinct of her training, made the call. For 6 hours, while compact security forces quietly locked down the station and swept the diplomatic ring looking for threats in all the places threats were supposed to come from, Tesley sat on a worn couch in a maintenance worker's cramped quarters, surrounded by spare parts and an embarrassing number of half-finished hobby projects, eating reheated noodles from the illegal Tuesday stand because it was the only food in the apartment, and for those 6 hours she was, for the first time in her entire dangerous, scrutinized life, genuinely hidden by nothing more than ordinary friendship. Cash sat with her the entire time, talking about nothing in particular. A story about a coolant valve that had once sprayed an entire engineering team with foam, an argument he'd had with another technician about whether a particular nebula chart was drawn correctly, keeping his voice steady and unhurried because he understood, without anyone having to explain it, that the most important thing he could give a frightened child was the simple, stubborn normalcy he'd been giving her for 2 years already. "Are you scared?" Tesla asked him at one point very quietly. "A little," Cash admitted, because he decided a long time ago never to lie to her about things that mattered. "But I trust the people working on this. And I trust that you're tougher than you think you are. You've been hiding your whole life and doing fine at it. This is just one more bad day." The threat was neutralized before it ever reached a residential block. A compact tactical team intercepted the infiltration team in the docking bay. The kind of clean, quiet resolution that would later be summarized in a single paragraph of an official report nobody outside the compact security apparatus would ever read. Tesla never knew the details. She only knew that Reska arrived at Cash's door near dawn, exhausted but relieved, to tell her it was over. But something had changed irreversibly in those 6 hours for everyone involved. Reska's report that week did not stay buried in routine channels. It reached, through a series of escalations that surprised even her, the desk of Sovereign Adrena Voss herself, not as a footnote, but as a central fact of an incident that had nearly cost the compact its air. The girl's life was saved, in the end, not by security protocol, but by a friendship the protocol had never accounted for, Reska wrote, with more bluntness than she had ever risked in an official document. "I recommend the Sovereign review this office's isolation strategy in its entirety." It was the first time anyone had dared tell Adrena Voss, in 2 years, that her plan to keep her granddaughter safe might have been, all along, the wrong plan entirely. Sovereign Adrena Voss had not set foot outside the compact central systems in 11 years. Her advisors considered such travel an unacceptable risk. Her enemies considered an opportunity they would happily exploit. And yet, 3 weeks after the failed infiltration attempt on Crossroads Station, her personal flagship arrived in the station's high-security berth, and the most powerful woman in the outer reach walked, for the first time in 2 years, toward the granddaughter she had kept safe by keeping her away. It was not, by any measure, a simple reunion. Adrena Voss was 71 years old, sharp-eyed and formidable, a woman who had spent 5 decades learning that affection was a vulnerability enemies could exploit and had therefore trained herself to ration it carefully. She had loved her granddaughter from a careful, guarded distance for 2 years because she had genuinely believed it was the only way to keep her alive, and Reska's report had appended that belief in a way that left the Sovereign, for the first time in longer than her staff could remember, visibly uncertain. She requested, before anything else, to meet the maintenance technician her granddaughter had been having lunch with for 2 years. Cash was summoned to a private conference room on the diplomatic ring with no explanation beyond, "The Sovereign wishes to speak with you," which was, understandably, one of the more alarming sentences he had ever heard directed at him. He showed up in his work uniform because he didn't own anything else appropriate, grease stains and all, and found himself standing across the table from a woman whose face he had only ever seen on news broadcasts, looking considerably more tired and considerably more human up close than any broadcast had ever suggested. "Mr. Calder," Adrena said, studying him with the same searching intensity her granddaughter had inherited. "I'm told you've had lunch with my granddaughter nearly every day for 2 years. "Yes, ma'am," Cash said, because there didn't seem to be any version of this conversation where lying would help. "And in 2 years, you never once attempted to use that relationship to your advantage. No requests for favors. No attempts to leverage her status. No reports to the press, despite what I imagine you could have sold that story for." It wasn't quite a question. "She's just a kid who needed somebody to eat lunch with," Cash said. Didn't seem like there was anything to leverage. Just seemed like there was a lonely kid, and I had half a sandwich. Something in Adrena Voss's carefully composed expression shifted, very slightly. The smallest crack in 50 years of practice control. "My security apparatus spent 2 years and considerable resources trying to keep her safe," she said. "And in the end, she was safest hiding in your quarters. Eating noodles, from what I understand, is an unlicensed food vendor. With respect, ma'am, I think she was safest because somebody finally treated her like a person instead of a problem to be managed. It was, by any reasonable measure, an extraordinarily bold thing to say to the ruler of 11 star systems. Cash realized at the moment the words left his mouth, and braced for whatever consequence might follow. Instead, Adrena Voss was quiet for a long moment, looking at him with an expression that he would later struggle to describe. Something between grief and recognition. "You're right," she said finally, "and I am ashamed it took a stranger to show me something I should have understood myself." She did not, in the end, separate Cash from her granddaughter, as half the room's nervous advisors had quietly expected she might. Instead, over the following months, the isolation protocol that had governed Tessely's life for 2 years was dismantled piece by piece, replaced by something far harder to design, but far more humane. A security strategy built not around total invisibility, but around genuine relationships, trusted adults, ordinary friendships allowed to exist in the open rather than hidden and feared. Tessely was permitted, for the first time, to acknowledge her friendship with Cash publicly. She was permitted to attend her tutoring sessions with actual classmates instead of isolated lessons. She was slowly allowed to become a real child living a real life, protected not by erasure but by the kind of careful, present guardianship that trusted people like Reska to do their jobs without requiring a girl disappear entirely from her own existence. And Crossroads Station, the unremarkable hub where this had all unfolded, the station that had nearly hosted a diplomatic catastrophe and instead hosted something far rarer, found itself, almost by accident, at the center of the Sovereign's attention in a way it had never been before. 5 years after a maintenance technician shared half a sandwich with a lonely girl in a crowded cafeteria, Crossroads Station signed a formal alliance treaty with the Venery Compact. Full trade privileges, mutual defense provisions, a permanent diplomatic seat that elevated the station from an anonymous waypoint to one of the most significant strategic assets in the Outer Reach. Historians who studied the alliance in the decades that followed would point, accurately enough, to the economic logic behind it. Crossroads Station sat at the intersection of 5 trade lanes. The compact needed a secure foothold in that sector. The negotiations, while lengthy, followed a fairly conventional diplomatic path once they began. The official record was full of trade ministers, legal frameworks, carefully worded clauses about tariffs and jurisdiction. What the official record did not say, what only a handful of people ever fully understood, was that the negotiations had begun not in a boardroom, but in a request Sovereign Adrena Voss made personally, quietly, almost as an afterthought to her advisors, that any treaty involving Crossroads Station include a specific, unusual provision, a permanent civilian liaison position created specifically for and offered specifically to one Cash Calder, environmental technician, 16 years of service, who would now also serve as an informal advisor on the human dimension of the compact's relationship with the station, a role with no real precedent. Invented because the Sovereign had decided, after watching her granddaughter flourish under his ordinary, undemanding friendship, that the compact needed more people who understood that. Power meant nothing if it forgot how to treat people decently. Cash, characteristically, found the whole thing somewhat embarrassing. He kept fixing coolant lines. He just also, now, occasionally sat in rooms with diplomats and reminded them, in his plain, unpolished way, what actual people on actual stations needed from their governments. And it turned out, much to everyone's surprise, except perhaps Adrena's, that this perspective made the treaty considerably stronger than it would have been otherwise. Tessely, by then 14, stood beside her grandmother at the formal signing ceremony, no longer hidden, no longer pretending to be an ordinary girl with no name worth knowing, but standing in the open as exactly who she was, the heir to the Venery Compact, and a girl who had grown up against every odd her circumstances had stacked against her, into someone capable of genuine warmth, because someone had once shown her what that looked like. She found Cash afterward, in the quiet after the ceremony's crowd had dispersed, standing by a viewport watching the docking bay the way he always had. "You didn't have to take the position, you know," she said, leaning beside him. "You could have just kept fixing coolant lines and let someone else deal with the diplomats." "Somebody's out to remind them what actually matters," Cash said, with a shrug that didn't quite hide how proud he was of the whole strange turn his life had taken. Besides, best window seat in the cafeteria's still mine. Figure I should earn it. Tessie laughed. The same easy, unguarded laugh she'd learned years ago, at a corner table where nobody had ever bothered to sit before. For the record, she said, you earned it 5 years ago, with half a sandwich. Years later, when scholars wrote about the Crossroad Identity Alliance, they would fill volumes with analysis of trade routes and defense pacts and the delicate diplomatic choreography that had brought two powers together. Almost none of them would mention a maintenance technician or a lonely 9-year-old girl. Almost none of them would understand that the entire foundation of that historic alliance, its trust, its warmth, the genuine goodwill that made it stronger than any treaty built on self-interest alone, had been laid down years before any diplomat entered a room on an ordinary day by an ordinary man who simply could not bring himself to eat his whole sandwich while a child sat alone and hungry for something nobody else thought to offer her. It had never been about politics. It had never been about power. It had started, as the truest and most important things so often do, with one small act of kindness that nobody thought would matter, and a girl who finally, after far too long, had someone who simply treated her like she was worth knowing.